Part one of this series, just a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the need for us as community to be a people of welcome, a people who are actually open to the idea that God will bring us together in all of our difference, and we have to live together in community and be the church. And then last week, Mark Hazard, a guest teacher, was with us talking about how living in that harmony requires something of us, draws something out of us to sometimes make the harmony of community work well. However, I often notice when we talk about community in church life, there's a tendency to talk about how to make it better, how to be the type of community people that we want to be, and essentially look forward into that. But as we're tracking our way through Romans 12 in this particular series, it strikes me that Paul does something that we should take some notice of, which is essentially to begin to think a little bit about what you might call the darker sides of relationships, the darker side of what's involved in being community. In chapter 12 and verse 17, Paul says this: "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." So I wanted to turn the conversation on this, the third week of our series, to questions of revenge and how we go about engaging with that within the church. To do that, I want to invite somebody who knows a lot more about this than me to the stage. So please welcome Dr. Susan Boon, who will be joining us for conversation this morning. Welcome, Susan. Have a seat. Now, so when I was prepping out this series, I'm thinking to myself, okay, so this is going to be a tough conversation. How do we talk about revenge? How do we talk about the sort of working that out? And then in the beautiful way that Westside, and only Westside in my experience, seems to be able to produce, I've been developing are we allowed to call ourselves friends yet? Is that okay? Susan and I got to know each other over the last year or so. And Susan, you've been at Westside about 2-3 years now?
Yes.
And Susan is professor of, in fact, I'll put this on screen here. Susan is a professor at the University of Calgary in the Department of Psychology. You're a social psychologist, and her specialist subject is revenge. There you go. So isn't it beautiful to be part of a community? It's like there's a sermon just in that there's somebody here every week at Westside who knows exactly what to talk about. Now, I need to clarify this. When I say she's in the first service, I said she was a specialist in revenge. And some people tried to book her to get back at some people. And so we just need to clarify a little bit that specialist in revenge, she's not like Liam Neeson from Taken. Okay? So although she did admit that she has some ideas if people need some.
I do. After the service, I'd be happy to help.
So the service just took an immediate turn. If there's more people come forward than normally for prayer, for revenge, I'm teaching this series for longer, okay? So Susan, tell us a little bit about that, because for many of us, like when I first had my first fascinating conversation with you, like to my shame, I thought, wow, revenge is a subject. I wouldn't even know how to begin on that. Tell us a little bit about what it means to study revenge in the way that you do.
What it means to study revenge in the way I do, I'm a social psychologist, and I'm a relationship researcher. I study the dark side of relationships, so I've been very excited coming to Westside and hearing David speak often about relationships and how God created us for relationships. Feels like coming home every time. I feel like a warm and accepting kind of place to be here where he talks about that. And for me, revenge is a really core topic in this area because I like to think of people as interdependent with each other. It doesn't matter if you're in a relationship with someone else or not. We all live in community. There's that famous quote or famous saying, "No man is an island." We all live our lives in ways where other people's decisions affect us and their actions and choices affect us. And so there are many, many opportunities for conflict in our daily lives, and sometimes we feel like we've been hurt or offended or provoked, and I think it's a very natural, instinctual feeling to want to retaliate in response to that, and I just love talking about revenge. and occasionally about forgiveness and unforgiveness and things like that. So, yeah, very happy to be here.
And so when the way you describe it just there, I find fascinating because like there's a level at which when we start to talk about revenge, at least in my experience, we think about that on pretty like kind of extreme scales. Doing nasty things to people. I know nasty things is that sounds to underplay it, but really quite violent things to
Yes.
people, even including murder,
Yes.
can all come in that. But then with your description of this, sometimes it sounds like we're talking just about getting even.
Yes.
And so I have a tendency to think, oh, I'm not a vengeful person. But if you talk about getting even, I get a little more uncomfortable in my seat, thinking, okay, maybe I do think about that. So do you only think about the kind of really dark stuff, or is it kind of everyday stuff as well that fascinates you?
Yes, in our research, we are very, very careful in almost every circumstance to avoid the use of the term revenge when we're talking with our participants, because when we do so, we think that we bring to mind the kinds of salacious events that you see and read about in the news. One of my favorites is when a woman had her cousins, they kidnapped a man she'd had a one-night stand with, and then they brought him to a hotel room and they branded an R on his forehead, and I'm not sure what the R was about, but she's facing some jail time as a result of that. And there was a case in London where a woman caused her ex-husband's yacht to explode. So there's some very, very serious things, of course, homicide, like David was mentioning, but more of what people do on an everyday basis is small things, like giving people the silent treatment, giving them the cold shoulder, being deliberately inconsiderate or rude, being late on purpose. And you were talking in the first service about deliberately not getting someone a coffee when you know that they'd like a coffee. And we make a distinction between, I like to say that what we study in the lab is everyday revenge, or revenge with a little r, not with the capital R, because the capital R makes people think of these really egregious acts. And if you ask people, do you get revenge against a romantic partner, they'll say absolutely not. In our early study, we conducted an interview and we asked people whether they'd gotten even with a partner. And we thought initially that maybe we would have difficulty. We'd find almost nobody who'd ever done this. And we found after interviewing about 100 people that were only about 5 of them who absolutely could not think of a time that they'd done that. But at least 3 of them spontaneously told us that they hadn't taken revenge. They'd just gotten even. So most people seem to be comfortable with admitting to some getting even.
Yeah.
But yeah, use the word revenge and it shuts down the conversation pretty fast.
And so you're also interested, if I understand correctly, about what that whole process of getting even, let's keep using that language then, of what it does to us in that sense. So there's something goes on in us, the person who's trying to get even, in the process of either doing that or not doing that. And particularly, so you mentioned that some people it's quite spontaneous. Other people it seems to be there's a time of rumination and thinking about it. What's your sort of insights into, because many of us, like you say, would probably relate to some sort of feeling of wanting to get even at some point in our lives. And sometimes that can be like it strikes me that I, in both my own life and in pastoral life, there's been events done to me that you would assume would be quite painful that I've gotten over much quicker than some really minor things that some people have done to me that still kind of churn away in my head and thinking, man, I should really, if I ever had a chance, I'd sort that out. Is that a sort of, like, I realize I'm now just trying to get free psychological advice. Is that a common thing? Or is that true for a lot of us, that there's a kind of rumination process of what we do?
I think that can be a really, really important piece of what drives some people to revenge. In most of the work that we've done, the people have taken their revenge fairly close upon the heels of the offense or provocation that led them to want to act. But I know in other research, sometimes they talk about people acting years afterwards, and it's that rumination piece. It's when they continue to fantasize about it and think about it and deliberate on it and cannot or will not let it go, and they eventually find an opportunity or an outlet. I mean, part of an important thing that you've got to do if you want to take revenge is you've got to find that opportunity. There's got to be a means and an opportunity, and sometimes it takes a while for that to appear in your life, but yeah, sometimes people will think a long time, and that rumination is really, really critical.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing for us as we listen to a conversation like this. So there's sometimes that immediate kind of gut reaction, which of course has huge implications to it sometimes, and people realize after the event, oh my goodness, I'm facing criminal proceedings. Or even, I think I told you, I remember being a young undergrad, and we were in a kind of fancy part of London one day, and there was a thrift store, and we knew it was a rich part of London, so we thought, hey, maybe the thrift store will be really cool. So there was a group of us in London for some time, so we went into this store, and the girls all of a sudden like, oh my goodness, there's this incredible rack of really expensive clothes going for like $1 a piece and something like that. So one of them said, hey, how come all these clothes are so cheap? And the lady said, oh yeah, a guy pulled up in a Rolls Royce yesterday, and he had discovered that his wife was away with someone else. So his first reaction was to take all of her clothes and just drive them down to the thrift store, which is revenge.
Yes, absolutely.
But then obviously there's you think of these stewed sort of long times of revenge. And so you sent me over some quotes in terms of thinking about our conversation. And so this might be a time to bring this one in. Here's a quote. I don't hold a grudge. I cradle it. I coddle it. I feed it fine cuts of meat and send it to the best schools. I nurture my grudges. I can't decide if the laughter is uncomfortable laughter or that we all know someone like that and that person is us. I'm not sure.
Could be.
But talk to us. So is this a kind of, like, I love this explanation. What do you see in a quote like this?
Joy is what I see. I guess I see, this is from a book written by Leigh Bardugo, and it's a character in the book who was deeply wounded at an earlier period in his life, and his life's motivation now is to get revenge, capital R, revenge, against the person that harmed him. And he's nursing that grudge and that desire for revenge for all that he's worth, and he's building every opportunity, he's taking advantage of everything to feed and to fuel his feelings. And I love this quote because it shows that holding a grudge can feel at least like a powerful thing. I think it can be an empowering move, and I very much think that that's what this character is speaking about here.
You also sent me the Hitchcock quote that revenge is sweet but not fattening.
Yes. Yes.
And so there's a sense in which there's something about us likes. And it strikes me, and this is what really fascinates me, when I hear this quote here, and even the Hitchcock notion, that it's almost not so much the revenge itself that we like, it's the thinking, it's the ruminating on the revenge. We like playing these scenarios over in our head. Is that?
I think that's part of it. There's a growing body of research now on the issue of whether revenge is satisfying. Is it truly sweet and not fattening or not? And the findings are really, really mixed. But one thing that seems to be clear is people expect it to be sweet. They expect it to be psychologically gratifying and rewarding. And at the same time, what they find when they actually take it is that sweetness, that positive emotion, the feeling good, doesn't seem to last. So there seems to be a disconnect between what we believe the experience would be like and the rewards that we think it will obtain us emotionally, and then what we actually experience afterwards.
Yeah, and it's like, for me, there's a weird sense that goes on in revenge. Like, I've had situations in my life where, I've done something to someone, even just like the ridiculous things that, we talk about, like, oh, they've upset me, so I'm not going to make them a coffee, And I can find that quite a satisfying experience. I don't know if anyone else can relate to that, where you actually think, yeah, I got even, I didn't make them a coffee. The person is completely oblivious to my revenge. And I have the reverse encounter of that. I bumped into somebody who I went to university once, and it was 10 years later. I bumped into this person, and in the context in which I bumped into them, I saw them and had this moment where I think, I feel like I know this person. And it transpired in bumping into them. I remembered, I went to university with this person, and they started talking to me. In the midst of the conversation, they start apologizing. They say, I really need to apologize. When we were at university, I hated you. I'm like, how could that be? And I really, really wasn't nice to you, and I've to be honest with you, I've had this in my heart for a while, and so the opportunity to apologize at that is really important to me. So that's a beautiful conversation. If it weren't for the fact that I was thinking, I can't remember your name. And it struck me as fascinating that here's somebody apologizing for something that they've 10 years later, they feel they need to apologize for, and it's had no impact on me. I don't remember this person being horrible to me. It might be that everyone's horrible to me, and I just become thick-skinned to it. But it struck me as you can carry something yourself, and the person be quite oblivious to that. And so revenge is doing more in you than just what you actually do. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, I think it would be. There's a controversy in the literature right now as to whether, in order for revenge to be satisfying and effective, you need to clearly communicate the message so that the recipient, the avengee, as we like to call them, knows that you got even, you took revenge, and you caused it, or whether you can have this sort of experience of like, I'm getting even and the other person doesn't even know about it, but still be satisfied. And there's some conflicting schools of thought around that.
So let's jump to the text that I started with, because I can read this text as a biblical scholar and find it interesting. I sent this to you and said I want to hear a social psychologist's point on this. And so we open up this text. It's about revenge. Quite quickly, you kind of get that sense. And so I want to almost, in our earlier conversations about this text, your first comment was...
It didn't sound very forgiving. It sounded more vengeful to me.
Right. So this was fascinating to me. So we read a text about revenge in the Bible, and your first comment was, this sounds like revenge.
Yeah.
The text appears to be saying it is vengeful. It is to say not be vengeful, but it sounds it. So if your enemy's hungry, feed him. That sounds nice. If he's thirsty, give him to something to drink. This is Proverbs 25 that Paul's quoting here in Romans 12. And then he rolls out this final line that changes the dynamic of what's being said. In doing this, you'll heap burning coals on his head. So do you want to unpack that?
I'd rather assume that having burning coals put on your head isn't a pleasant experience. And so, I think that what's going on here is a sort of subterfuge. It sounds like you're looking like you're forgiving the person and you're being kind and generous, but really, in the back of your head, in the back of your mind, your actions, or you're assuming that your actions are actually doing this individual harm. So one of the questions I'm not sure of here is if this is sort of a metaphor, that the heaping burning coals, if what that's really saying is you're going to make them feel guilty because now they've treated you in a harsh, harmful way, they've provoked you, and you've returned kindness, and we know that's not human nature to return kindness for harm. Yeah. So is the idea that you're making them feel guilty because they recognize that they treated you badly and you're treating them nicely, or if this is talking about the future and God will rain down justice upon them with burning coals as part of the process, or just how that operates?
It strikes me that there's something deeply dissatisfying about someone you don't like being nice to you, right?
I would think so.
And I say it with some experience. But no, it seems that would, when you do evil to someone, if they return that with kindness, that's quite irritating. Whereas when they return with evil, you go, well, that's exactly what I expected.
Yeah, I knew they were the kind of person that were like that, and so I just preemptively harmed them because I knew they were dirt.
Yes, and so for me, what's fascinating with this text, a very quick reading of it, it's easy, I think, as a Christian to go, okay, don't be revenge, don't do any revenge, right? But then little things start to jump out in a conversation like this. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. So it's not, do not repay anyone for evil, right? So Paul's not saying don't repay anyone. He's saying just don't use evil to repay that. So, which I think changes the dynamics. So he's not saying you can't do anything to someone who's wronged you. He's saying be creative in what you do to them. And
yes.
And don't let that creativity be driven by evilness, right?
Yeah.
Because this creates a cycle of violence. So, I do something to you, you take revenge on me, then I take revenge on you. It's been said in several contexts that if you really do work out an eye for an eye life, everybody ends up blind in the end, It also interests me that the language of do not take revenge, and I understand translators have to use words that make sense to us, but the language behind, the Greek word behind what we translate revenge is kind of the language of don't do what is unrighteous. So particularly in Romans, that's fascinating, that you have all this language of God embedding us with his righteousness. But what if someone does wrong to you? Well, don't immediately revert to an old way of life where you just start rolling unrighteousness back towards them. But it seems that this idea, do not be overcome by evil, this is kind of hanging all of this together with Paul. Bad stuff's going to happen to you. It seems that our choice is, we're not going to go soft on evil. We're not going to go, it's okay that you did nasty stuff for me. I am going to respond, but my response is going to be surprising. My response is going to be unusual. My response is going to leave you not sure what to do. How would that work in a revenge world?
I think that's a really interesting idea, because certainly when I've heard this passage preached in churches before, I thought it's one of those, turn the cheek, turn the other cheek, and let them slap the other cheek. But what you're suggesting here, I think your interpretation allows for a response that isn't an immediate "I forgive you" response. It allows you to be more creative and to continue, I think, to apply consequences is the word I'm looking for. The literature is pretty clear that if people don't get the message that their behavior is wrong, they're not going to change it. If it's still working for them, then there'd be no motivation to change it. And a problem with simply allowing things to move forward, expressing forgiveness or allowing someone to believe that there's been forgiveness, is they may not get that message that you were hurt and you were upset, and they may continue that behavior. And it may not be because they want to hurt you or because they're lazy or just don't want to change. Maybe because they honestly don't know that they hurt you. So sort of an automatic, "Oh, I forgive you," could be a problematic response. There needs to be some sort of consequence. And one of the things that the research on forgiveness says is that most of the time we don't actually communicate forgiveness in any verbal kind of a way. We very rarely say, "I forgive you." It's more kind of in how the future interactions unfold that we sort of allow that message to be inferred. So if we're just, business as usual afterwards, how would you expect someone to know that they've hurt you? So I think that this leaves open the possibility that, when someone harms you, that doesn't necessarily mean it's business as usual. I don't think
Yes.
my interpretation of your interpretation of Paul's interpretation here is that play that a few more times is that there's room for more than simply turning the other cheek.
Yes, and for me, this is why I find your whole subject area fascinating, because I think recent traditional Christian readings of recent Christian interpretation, I think a lot of Christians find themselves feeling very cornered when it comes to questions of, "I have been wronged." Because the implication in a lot of the way we unpack texts like this seems to be, there's nothing you can do, you have to leave it all to God. Whereas I think, to me, what Paul's saying here is, God will ultimately level everything and sort these things out. You can respond. And then here's the kind of little tweak of the Christian community is just don't respond like everybody else, because that just draws you in. So there's a quote that you sent over, which I'm trying to find. Let me jump forward. Here you go. So this is William Ian Miller from Eye for an Eye. "Where we start the story will determine who owes and who is owed. Desert is a function of an arbitrary decision as to when to start the camera rolling, or of what state of affairs to declare the initial equilibrium position." So it strikes me that there's another tweak in the conversation that says, how do I play my way out of this? How do I not get caught up into a cycle of violence? But also there's an interesting thing about, the way I would tell the story of events that have happened to me that I've wanted to seek revenge almost always begins with somebody doing something wrong to me, right? Never begins with the thing that I did in the first place that caused them to do that. And it might cycle right the way back to, well, you think about how many in office place, conflict, it starts way back and it slowly escalates and escalates and escalates to the point that one person is able to tell the story in a way that the other person looks terrible. Is that, am I understanding what Miller's saying here correctly, or?
I think you are, absolutely. And this is a real problem for me with the forgiveness literature, which until fairly recently has been sort of painting this really idealized virtue version of forgiveness, where forgiveness is the end-all, be-all response no matter whatever's happened to you. And a problem with most of the research is that it takes a snapshot in time, and it starts by asking people, tell us about a time when you were hurt, and it doesn't ask people to consider at any point prior to that, what may they have done. I'm not saying that the victim is necessarily to blame for their actions, or I'm not trying to say that the victim is at all to blame for their actions, but there may be, if you think about it, in relationships especially, they don't just start here. There's a history, and maybe what you did, what was done to you, you didn't cause, but there might have been something that happened before that part that precipitated that person's actions in some way, however far back you've got to go. And this snapshot view, it doesn't begin to show the real complexity of these patterns of interactions and histories of interactions in families. Think of families and how complex they are and how long their histories are. And if you think at the international level, where with some of the countries that are currently battling incredible, tensions and things like that. Sometimes they're thinking about events that happened hundreds of years ago, sometimes longer than that. And the issue of who is the victim and who is the perpetrator or who's the offender, it's not at all an easy judgment to make. And one of the things that has become really, really clear in the forgiveness literature is how important humility is and empathy in moving towards forgiveness. And it's the ability to recognize that you too, once in a while, I mean, not me, but I'm sure you've had to be forgiven once in a while. So I've never been there. My family's sitting in the back going, oh, wow, she's making that one up. I mean, if you've never done anything wrong, it's very much that, you cast the first stone. I mean, even if you're not responsible for you didn't in any way cause the particular offense that was done to you, you've probably needed forgiveness at some point. And just recognizing that most of us transition between that role of victim and offender. It's not an easy, just cut and dry, black and white, slice it here and separate it.
And this for me is what's fascinating, the way you frame that there, like as a person that's thinking a lot about Romans in this particular year, is because Paul has spent 11 chapters almost establishing exactly that we come now to this question of revenge and forgiveness from the perspective of 11 chapters of Paul reminding us we are forgiven people. And that seems to be, because it strikes me that forgiveness and revenge often come from a position of power and superiority. So, that well, you've wronged me, and therefore I'm better than you, so now I will give you forgiveness if I feel you deserve it, or I will extract revenge if I feel you don't. But it leaves me in the position of, and I've never done anything wrong. And again, not to try and suggest that you're to blame for the things that have happened, but it strikes me that when we enter this passage in Romans, if you've been reading the whole book, your mindset is, my goodness, God is a God who has forgiven me, so I am a forgiven person. And I wonder sometimes if that's why Paul asks for this creative take on vengeance, because it actually forces you to do what is not natural, because oftentimes like that initial reactive revenge statement almost comes from somewhere within us that we don't have to think about. Whereas if I have to think about being kind as a form of getting even, it requires me to stop and think. And maybe in that process of stopping and thinking, I'll think about my own responsibility in this process. Would that
that
make
makes
sense?
a lot of sense to me. I mean, in one of our early studies, we asked people to tell us about a time when they'd gotten even or a time when they wanted to but did not. And it was that thought, that additional little bit of thought that seemed to distinguish between people who when they did and when they didn't. If they stopped to think about they'd done similar things or about the consequences that might ensue.
And so that makes me want to push a little bit further towards the forgiveness conversation. I feel that when it comes to the kind of general language in recent history of the church, our conversations about forgiveness have been quite one-dimensional. So when we hear about forgiveness, a lot of us immediately comes to mind, the conversation with Jesus and Peter. Oh, how many times should I forgive? Well, you should just keep forgiving. You should always forgive. And forgiveness to many of us kind of ends up feeling like, again, weakness, disempoweredness. I just have to forgive them. I've had conversations with parents in church who have kind of tried to figure this out with their kids. What do you do if someone bullies? You just got to be forgiving to them. And it leaves us feeling cornered oftentimes, and almost leaves us like what we're saying is what happened to us was okay.
Yes.
But your take on forgiveness would obviously want to push against that sort of thing. And so I'm interested to hear you talk about that.
One of the complexities in the research literature comes around scholars themselves, people who study forgiveness, not agreeing on what forgiveness means, and more than that, having a view of forgiveness that often differs a lot from what the general public believes forgiving to mean. So it seems that many people in the general public believe that forgiving is more or less saying that what was done to you was okay. So to forgive is to say that what you did was all right. And that's considered condoning, or depending on the circumstances, that may be considered excusing.
Which is why many of us just don't want to forgive.
No, well, why would you? I mean, if what they've done is truly wrong, then you shouldn't say it's okay. And in fact, it would be harmful to say it's okay. And that's exactly what people who study forgiveness say is no, at no point should the forgiveness, the giving of forgiveness imply in any way that what they did was all right. That would be condoning it. It is not all right. And I think that, that confusion that forgiving means that might be sometimes what stops people from being willing to forgive.
Yes.
That there are ways to forgive where you make it very clear that was not okay. But because you've repented, because you've apologized, because you've acknowledged your responsibility, because you've made amends, because I know you're truly sorry, I'm willing to forgive you. What you did, don't do it again. Let me be clear. What you did wasn't okay, but I can forgive you and we can move on.
Yeah. And I think many of us would be worried about forgiveness for those very reasons. So I think about something I know that you study regularly, something that we encounter a lot as pastors. You think of like marriage breakdown. I've been in situations where I've, had friends and congregation members in various aspects of my pastoral ministry where perhaps there's been a violent partner, and to say that that's okay is terrible, and to say that that should be forgotten. I sometimes wonder, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, that in the contemporary language used about forgiveness, it almost seems like we're talking about just forgetting, and almost like, just as if it never happened, which I think, one theologian said, I can't remember who it was, but one theologian said once that only God can truly forget, and that if we try and forget, we might find ourselves caught back in these cycles of really unhealthy spaces. If we just forgive people who don't admit that what they did was wrong, we might and we then forget about it. We end up back in really unhealthy spaces. Would that be, what would your thoughts be on something like that?
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's, I don't know that you should forget, and also I don't know if it's always possible to forget. And in the literature, they discuss forgiveness as something that is a process. It's something that you have to renew the commitment, depending on the severity of the offense. You have to renew the commitment to forgive on a daily basis, possibly more often than that, because we don't forget. It's actually very difficult. If it's any kind of offense of any magnitude, it's very difficult. Maybe you will never forget it. And there are good reasons, especially in the case of an abusive relationship, not to forget.
Yes.
Slowly, the literature is starting to realize that there are potential problems and pitfalls associated with forgiveness, and then it shouldn't always be offered. And it was some of the work with people in abusive relationships that made that. It was some of the earliest work showing that no, that there are real costs. There can be real costs with forgiveness done wrong.
Yes.
And the way that it's encouraged and preached in this sort of view that it should be done all the time, and why can't you forgive? Why won't you forgive? That can be really harmful.
So it seems that there's a level at which, thinking about my own self and the wrongs that have been done to me, it's important that I think about how I don't let them fester and turn into violent retribution. But it also seems to be that it's important that I don't just forgive and therefore drop myself back into a harmful situation, back into and so to me this sounds very biblical, right? And whereas to a lot of people it doesn't. The moment you say in church, maybe there's times you shouldn't forgive, like there's a little bit of, many of us would go, well, I don't know that you're allowed to say that in church. That might be not what we believe. I know you and I have had the conversation, is this even acceptable to say as a Christian? But then, so I want to jump to a text here for a moment. Let's go to Matthew chapter 18. So this is a fascinating text for me because of where we started this conversation, where the famous bit right at the bottom there in Matthew chapter 18, Peter comes to Jesus and says, how many times shall I forgive my brother and sister who sins against me? And then Peter goes with, I always love this with Peter, he tries to really impress Jesus, 7 times, right? To which Jesus says, I tell you not 7 times, 77 times. Now, with a bad understanding of forgiveness, this sounds like, somebody can beat you up 77 times and you just keep forgiving them, right? And I've heard almost that sort of thing preached, and I've heard of people staying in deeply unhealthy relationships and dangerous relationships as a result of this. But as I kind of say a lot, it's often about, well, what's going on in the wider context of this passage? And the very preceding account is Jesus throwing out this idea of, if your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen, you've won them over. But if they will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If still they refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Now, to me, this is quite a fascinating text. Interestingly, actually, the text is quite long. It then continues where you get a famous passage. Jesus says, where 2 or 3 agree, God is there, right? So it's interesting that language of 2 or 3 agreeing is in the wider context of forgiveness and revenge, almost at some level. But it strikes me that in context, this makes sense of what Jesus said and Peter's conversation afterwards, that there is a conflict required. So on the Bible's take on vengeance seems to be be creative and think about how to be kind in that. Its take on forgiveness seems to be, actually it might require conflict. It's not forgetting. It's actually the complete opposite of saying it's okay. Here is Jesus saying, you're actually going to the person and saying, this is not okay. Right? But I'd like you to sort it out. I'd like you to admit that it wasn't okay. I'd like to accept your fault. I'd like us to try and build this back together. What I find stunning in this is that Jesus then rolls out a sequence of events of which if the person refuses to accept that it wasn't okay what they did, there's actually a distancing created. There's actually a, yeah, okay, you can't be with this anymore. And it also, and this is very much in keeping with what you see in the Old Testament, therefore forgiveness isn't able to be rolled out because you can't forgive someone that doesn't want to be forgiven. You can let it go yourself, but you can't, and so that would be my biblical take on this. And I'm curious, how does that relate to your kind of social psychological take on something like this?
I think it's a very subtle and nuanced take of this, and something that I haven't heard before in the church. I mean, I sometimes struggle being a Christian and having been raised in the church, and I've heard these verses over and over again, and grown up kind of believing you got to forgive every time, everything, no matter what, or else your own forgiveness of God by God is at stake. And then I study revenge and I study forgiveness, and I'm looking at what my participants are telling us, and I'm reading in the literature, and it's like this, I don't know how to reconcile these two things. And I think what you said here is really beautiful, because it suggests that it's not just you forgive and you forgive no matter what, unconditionally every time. It's like you've got to make it clear to the person. You go to the first time and you make it clear to them what they've done and how you feel about it. And if they're still not listening and they're still unrepentant and they don't change their ways, then you bring on board someone else to help make your case. And then, that's when you would forgive. And if they're not willing at that point, if they're still stuck in their ways and don't see that they've done anything wrong, I think I hear you saying that you're off the hook. Am I reading too much into this? I mean, yeah. No, well, you leave it to God at that point.
That to me that's how I would read this particular text. Because God is in agreement with that need to be in harmony, but you can't be in harmony if somebody's doing something that's not okay. And so this is my take on this passage, that this is how you then make sense of Peter's comment to Jesus. So we often think, that this is just a carte blanche, forgive everyone. But what it seems to me what Peter's responding to is, it'd be almost easier just to forget about it, right? Okay, they did wrong. I'm just going to forget about that and move on, right? And Peter's saying to Jesus, so how many times do we have to go through this conflict process? 7, and then can we walk away? And Jesus seems to be saying, well, if the person's willing to be forgiven, you're always going to keep coming back and conflicting that. And you'll keep, and if they're genuine, but you don't keep forgiving someone who's saying, I didn't even do something that was wrong, right? Because you can't forgive someone, and you can't bring it back to the level space. You can't be in relationship, with somebody who's abusing you, right? So actually it's a lie to try and live out the sense that, this is a great relationship, when they're refusing to admit that the way that they treat you is harmful, And so my personal belief is that I think if you read Old Testament scriptures and also texts like this in the New Testament, that forgiveness requires an agreement between both parties. Now that doesn't mean that there are times, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, I would say that the person who has been wronged, so somebody's refusing to admit they did anything wrong. The person who's been wronged still has to go through the psychological process of letting that go then.
Yes.
And not allowing that to shape and define their whole life. But I don't think you can forgive someone if they're not even aware of the fact that what they did was wrong in the first place. That would be my take on that. How does that sit with you?
I think that fits really well with what I happen to believe to be true about forgiveness. I mean, there's a distinction that we can make between the kind of forgiveness that you explicitly communicate to the person who's wronged you, and then the kind of forgiveness that occurs entirely within yourself and is about dealing with your emotions and, as Christians with God and God's view on things, but doesn't require that you have any further contact or any communication with the person who wronged you.
Yes.
And I think that what you're showing there is, there could be these two separate things that are going on. And that Bardugo quote earlier about coddling the grudge. I mean, it sounds like, I think it is empowering to hold a grudge. There are benefits and advantages to maintaining the victim status. It allows you to make claims and expect behavior from the perpetrator and from other people that, too bad, you're a victim, we're so sorry for you, and things like that. But at the same time, if you go to the lengths of coddling it and giving it the finest cuts of meat and sending it to the best schools, and I know that's all allegory there, but if you are really trying to fuel that grudge, then you're hurting yourself.
Yes.
And the other person may not know. And how can you possibly harm them if they're not even aware?
Yeah.
If they're not experiencing harm, then the only one who's suffering here is you yourself. And so there's reason to let go of that, even if you never forget it and you never forgive them in a communicative sense. If you have no further contact with them, you can deal with those emotions yourself and let that go.
So what fascinates me in the conversation with yourself then and these biblical texts is that what you don't get, which I think is what often we feel, what you don't get from Scripture is, oh, just overlook bad stuff that happens to you. And I hope that in a conversation like this, we go away thinking, actually, it might be tough, right? It might require a lot from us, but the Bible doesn't leave us cornered when we're wrong. It actually asks us confront the wrongdoing. How do you respond to wrongdoing? Actually, it seems to me you confront it, and also you respond with good, not evil, which is actually a very different take than what I've often heard, and it really is helpful to talk to you with your wider sort of view on these particular fields. So thank you so much for talking with us this morning. I think for me and for all of us, what I'd love us to do is to think about this in terms of that place of, well, the place that I arrive at any wrong that's done to me is to remember that actually I am a forgiven person in the first place. And that might color how I seek out restitution, how I seek out forgiveness and things like that. I want to end with a prayer that the theologian Stanley Hauerwas wrote. And the prayer is called, I do not want my enemies forgiven. It says, and hopefully you'll forgive me for reading this prayer in church. Forgiven, Lord, I do not want my enemies forgiven. I want you to kill them, as sometimes prays the psalmist. Actually, I would prefer to pray that you punish them rather than kill them, since I would like to watch them suffer. Also, I fear losing my enemies, since my hates are more precious to me than my loves. If I lost my hates, my enemies, how would I know who I am? Yet you have bent us towards reconciliation, that we may be able to pass one another Christ's peace. It is a terrible thing to ask of us. I am sure I cannot do it, but you are a wily God, able to accomplish miracles. May we be struck alive with the miracle of your grace, even to being reconciled with ourselves. Amen. Susan, thank you for being with us. May God's grace and peace be with you this week. God bless.